Professor, you are an established linguist and scholar in literature and a creative writer. How is it you developed interest in folkloristics?
First of all, I didn't begin as a linguist. I began originally as my first degree was in English, and my interests were in South Indian languages, Kannada and Tamil. Though I don't have degrees in it, I had studied Kannada and Tamil all along. When I was even doing English, I was doing Kannada and Tamil, because I very quickly began to see that without you have to cultivate even your mother tongue. It's not enough to cultivate foreign languages. You have to cultivate your own mother tongue as deeply as you would cultivate, with as much trouble, with as much labor, as you cultivate a foreign language. Without it, one doesn't really reach any full expression nor any insight into either one's own culture or any culture, in my opinion, because the mother tongue reaches deep into one's childhood on the one hand, and it also reaches into all strata of society. Whereas if you stayed with English, you stopped with 1%. It's like Sanskrit. In fact, it is worse than Sanskrit, because at least Sanskrit gives you an insight into your own past and into religion and various technical treatises and Indian science and all the rest. Whereas English, while it is international on the one hand, while we need it, will make us superficial with regard to our own culture. So somewhere along the line, I was not thinking any of this, I felt the need to cultivate both Kannada and Tamil. And in doing that, I became somewhere along the line, I became aware that for an Indian, there's not only the culture of the book, the culture of what I call the father tongues, like Sanskrit and English at this point, but also the culture of the mother tongues. And the culture of the mother tongues is not only what you call literature, but also folk materials. In fact, in a recent paper, I wrote that the house in which we lived in Mysore had several stories, and we spoke Tamil downstairs with my mother, grandmother, and cooks and so on. I'll give you a copy and Dadalus. And upstairs, my father was a mathematician, and we spoke English, and he had Sanskrit. So, and then there was a higher one, which was open to the sky, from where you could see the palace, which was all lit up, or you could also see the Golageri down there. And if there was any big quarrel there or anything like that, and you heard it, you would come all the way down and go to watch that. So the house seemed like a symbolic of this multiple culture. That's not special to me. It's true of all of us, of all educated people in India. And somewhere along the line, it became important to me to take the whole range of our culture somehow, to learn as much as possible. So I used to hear lots of folk tales particularly in Tamil, both from our cooks, from our aunts, from our grandmother. So I began that almost from childhood. Somewhere around my 20th year, I read the works of Verrier Elwin, and then I wanted very much to become an anthropologist. I wanted to give up literature and wanted to become an anthropologist. I wrote him letters, and he didn't even reply to me. Elwin, because I said I'll come and work with you, and I was very taken with it, because I read his folk tales of Mahakoshal and folk songs of Chhattisgarh and things like that. And that was almost the beginning of that. And then I began to collect. Then I went to Belgaum, and there by that time I had collected a lot of proverbs, and I was interested in proverbs of the world, and I had translated about 4,000 or 5,000 proverbs from different languages, of course through English. And I'd become very interested in them. I used to give lectures on it, and one of those lectures for the Karnataka University extension, became that little book called Gadagalu, which was one of the first books written on the subject. And then along with it, I wanted to publish a collection of proverbs, which of course Karnataka University did not wish to publish because they didn't see any use for it at that time. And so I have actually lost them. This translation of about 3,000 Chinese, Japanese, Punjabi, it's lost. I don't know where my manuscript is. I had done that in those years. And then I actually proposed to them I would survey proverbs in the province, Belgaum province and so on, and ask them whether they would publish it. Again, they were not interested. Anyway, none of this is important for this interview. But all I'm saying is that we have still not done that work, which I wanted very much to do at the time, that we should collect proverbs by actually going into the field. Our proverb collections are still mainly from people's memories and from that's what we have done in field and contextually collected. We never did that. That was 1955. And around that time, while I was getting interested in tales, I was collecting them from my house, and then I met a school teacher, a primary school teacher. His name is Kurubetti. I've lost touch with him. I don't know whether he's alive or what he is. And he used to come and see me. Lots of people used to come, and in Belgaum there were people who used to come and visit me, and we used to talk, and there were people of all kinds who used to be interested in what I was doing. I would take walks with them and talk to them. And one of them was a primary school teacher. And I asked him one day whether his children, who were all 7, 8 years old, who had begun to learn to write, would write down for me the stories they had heard at home. My interest then was to find tellers, and I thought this would be a good way of going to the tellers, if the children gave me stories. And so what he did was he asked his class, in a composition class, to write down stories just as they heard it. And they wrote some fantastic stories, because they wrote not in grammatical Kannada, but exactly as they had heard it. Because, and so it was really wonderful stories. Hanchi, that story came to me from one, I still have that manuscript somewhere. And this was 1955. And around that time there was a man named Edwin Kirkland, who came to Bombay as a cultural affairs officer from Florida. And I was doing all kinds of things in Lingaraj College. I was the president of the English Union, and I used to run the debating society as teachers, we were in charge of all those things. And I used to do the drama society and things like that. And this Edwin Kirkland came, I had invited him because in those days all these cultural affairs officers used to visit colleges because they wanted to see whether they could do something about American literature and things like that. So he came to Belgaum to talk. We had arranged a little lecture for him. And then after the lecture I went and sat with him and we talked. And he told me a story. And then I gave him an Indian parallel and an analog and so on. And he was surprised that someone in Belgaum knew about folklore and was interested in proverbs, and then we began to talk about proverbs and things like that. And so he got very interested in me. And then he went back to Bombay and sent me a copy of Stick Thompson's The Folk Tale, which I had never even heard of. And in it there was all this description of motifs and types, and this was 1955, remember? 55. Oh, 35 years. Right. And then he said that if I translated any of my tales and made notes according to motifs and types, he would help me publish it. And he was one of the editors of the Southern Folklore Quarterly in Florida. So I sent him 4 tales with notes and types and all the rest of it. And then he published them. And it is the same Edwin Kirkland who later did South Asian Bibliography. He's the same. He's the same. So then it began from then on. And then I read Stick Thompson, and then he also sent me Maria Leach's Funk and Wagnall's Standard Dictionary of Folklore and Mythology. And then I read through it all, actually. And then I read the life of the brothers Grimm. And then at that time it occurred to me that nobody had done anything for Kannada except Mary Fair. And and nothing was available. And so I began to collect at that time.
So then it became an intellectual pursuit.
Then, so
analysis.
And I went on collecting things, and I've been collecting tales ever since.
How many tales do you have collected?
I have about 500-600 tales.
From Kannada?
Have been transcribed and
they've all been transcribed. I've got them filed and everything. I don't know how much of it. Many of them are variants. I have about 120-130 types, and I have variants for many of them, 5-6 variants. And for that Oedipus story, on which I wrote, which I collected in 1963 from Kittur, I must have 40 variants. See, later what I did was, I published that story in Sudha, and asked them, if anybody has a story, send me. So 40 people sent me stories. So one day I'm going to write a piece on a variation of that Oedipus tale. I have not yet finished that.
Regarding the Proud's manuscript which you submitted to Karnataka University, so after you did...
I didn't submit it. They didn't even want to see it.
So now it lies in...
It's somewhere, I don't know where it is. I have not found it at all. Because, I have moved from place to place to place. When I moved away from Karnataka, I went to Baroda, and then I got interested in linguistics. All along I was interested. I used to teach a history of English language, and through that I became interested in linguistics. And then it occurred to me that teaching English was not what I wanted to do. Because till then I taught English, I read English. For 7 years I taught English. Then it became very important to me not to teach English anymore. I felt that I have to work in the mother tongues. I have to do that because I have to study India, it seemed to me. And I cannot study India without knowing the language of so I wanted to study it through the languages I knew, which is Kannada and Tamil. So English became, till then Kannada and Tamil were my side issues, and I was professionally an English teacher. Later I changed that, I reversed that. I became professionally involved in Dravidian languages, and English became my hobby almost.
So how do you feel about it now?
Oh, very good. One of the best things that has happened to me is that, of course, it has deepened my knowledge of India and of myself, actually. Because all this is done to discover oneself, because the more deeply you know your mother tongue, the more deeply you know yourself.
As a creative writer, are you influenced by the folklore?
I think so. I have a number of poems which use folk motifs, and both in Kannada and in English.
Can you give 1 or 2 examples of which motif are...
For instance, do you know the poem in Striders which reminds me, which you can find in the book if you want to print it, where I use the story of the of the queens who are barren. A king has many queens, he is barren as usual. He goes to the forest and meets a sage. The sage gives him a mango, and he says, this is different. He brings it back and he gives it to his queens. The queens sit on the balcony and eat the mangoes, eat all the sweet parts of the mangoes, and throw away the seed. And the dog downstairs, a little mangy dog, a bitch, eats the mango seed, hard seed. And guess who gets pregnant? The dog. The queens are still barren, though they have eaten all the sweet parts. So I use that to say that poets are like this dog. The poets don't get to sit on the balcony. They are not rich. They cannot get the sweet parts of it, but they will get pregnant. They will produce, they're not barren. So there is a poem in English called Which Reminds Me. That's what it's called. And I end with that folk tale. I may be talking a lot. Talking more than... No, I was saying that's a good example of that,
I mean, when you are in Baroda and some other parts out of Karnataka, did you made any attempt of collecting any?
I was not a collector in that sense of the word. Ultimately, one has to collect, I think, in a language and a dialect That is very important. Otherwise, you don't understand what's happening.
And how is it you concentrated your attention on South Asian folklore?
Not even South Asian. Basically Kannada and Tamil. Because, I don't say that's all, but that's a great deal. Because, why I'm saying this is, and not because I'm not saying this because there's a great deal in that sense of the word. Every language is infinite. Any single language is absolutely infinite. If you become a linguist, you can study, say, a language like Kannada forever, or a language like English, right? So one of the things I decided somewhere along the line, once I realized the infinite riches that are in any single language, I decided not to learn new languages.
This is sufficient.
I thought Kannada, Tamil and English are enough for me for a lifetime. Of course, I have hardly covered anything in these, I don't know many things. I've not read many of the great texts even in Kannada and Tamil and English, though I have read them all my life. There is still so much more. Just if you take folklore, every time I come back, I see, I should be here to do something or the other. Every day you learn something new about these languages, the folk materials, and also the literature and the culture. When that is the case, adding new languages will only give me a smattering of them. It will make me only superficial. So, not even South Asia. South Asia is already too big for me. So, I decided when I became a linguist, I learnt new languages. I passed examinations in French and German. I even took courses in Japanese. But then I knew, and Russian. But then I decided that to do anything in these languages, I would have to spend 20 years in every one of those languages to do anything worthwhile.
So is it the same reason for you?
So I said, no, I'm not going to do anything more. So that's why I don't even say I know any of these languages. I worked on each of them for 6 months each. And it made me realize how much there is in every language. And I couldn't simply master any of them. So I said I must master the languages I already know.
So is that the same reason for you're not working in American folklore?
Absolutely.
Staying there for the last
decades. No, but this is enough. I don't have time. No, because every day in Chicago we get books. Every few months we get books from the Kannada region and from the Tamil region. I look through them, and in looking through them I take what I want and read. But where is the time to do anything else? I also keep up with English and American literature, because that's a part of my interest, particularly poetry. I read whatever I can lay my hands on. That keeps me very busy.
You have used the concepts of Aham and Puram to explain the genres of South Indian folklore. Do you think it's a universal?
The word universal is a word I don't like. No. Though both in linguistics and in cultural anthropology and in folklore, people are always looking for universals. I wish we could find them. But I think one is very suspicious of any universal categories. It seems to me, therefore I'm not looking for universal categories.
Culture specific?
I think culture specific, and from there maybe if it is possible to enlarge them, extend them, modify them, then I would like to do that. First of all, it is enough for me if I could understand Kannada or Tamil or these materials. I'm not looking for universals in that sense of the word, because universals are very quickly reached in lots of ways, but it's very hard to prove them, and I think they come in the way of our understanding local materials. Though I do believe ultimately we must press towards it, whether we reach it or not, it seems to me. And to come to Aham and Puram are extraordinary cultural concepts in Tamil literature. They're not only Tamil concepts, they probably are old Dravidian concepts. if you look at the Dravidian etymological dictionary, you will find that Aham and Puram as words occur in Kannada, Tamil, Tulu, Malayalam, certainly all the South Dravidian languages. And I can't tell you whether they occur also in Toda. So I think that if you reconstruct these words, they go even earlier than Tamil. So it seems to me they seem to be an old pair of cultural categories. And I'm also impressed by the way the Tamil poeticians, particularly the Tolkapian, develops this concept. To develop this concept as a set of binary appositions. And it's more interesting than the usual binary appositions because it contains many binary appositions, beginning with interior and exterior, and self and others, heart and the outer parts of the body, earth and or habitable parts, or the habitables, the settlements, human settlements, and jungle where people cannot be, or earth and sea, or the whole genre of Aham poetry, which is usually love poetry, poetry of things which happen between a man and a woman, and Puram, which is about society, about politics, about war, about conflict. So they have developed these two kinds of these native categories. So as I'm interested in native categories, I'm also interested in native analytic categories.
That's ethnic categories.
What I would call native categories or native analytic categories. The way to talk about it is, for instance, all languages have tense. But that's not enough. We also, if you want to speak about Kannada, you must look at what tenses Kannada has, right? And that cannot be inferred by any general theory. The only thing you can do is come to Kannada and find out what tenses people actually have, right? And it is the same with folklore, it seems to me. It is true that the distinction between tale and myth exists in probably all languages. That is, if you want to speak of it in those terms, tale is that which is framed in a fictional framework, and myth, which is considered as telling the truth about the world in some sense, and which is sacred, and tale not being sacred. And of course one can talk more about that. You can make all kinds of other distinctions. But if you speak of that, you cannot assume that the distinction between tale and myth will be the same in all cultures. The lines that are drawn between tale and myth, though the categories may be universal, the actual distinctions might be culturally coded. And I was thinking that Aham and Puram would be useful to distinguish, for instance, tale and myth. I think of myth as Puram and tale as Aham. And there are many reasons for doing this. One of them is, one of the things that the classical Tamil category of Aham does is that in an Aham poem, there are no names. And you'll find that folk tales have no names, by and large. And Aham categories have to do more with the interior, with psychology, with kinship relationships, with marriage, with love, right? Whereas the Puram has to do with society, with the cosmos, with conflict, with politics, right? And you find that myths are like that. Myths are about wars. If you take Indian myths, the war between gods and demons will occur in the mythology of every god or goddess. Whether it's Vishnu or Shiva or Devi, they have to fight wars. In fact, in myths you don't find stories about mothers-in-law. And in folk tales you don't find stories about wars. You won't find a great war being described in a folk tale. You see? So there are many of these things seem to fit the Ahampuram categories.
And this is something definitely new.
And this is not the way we usually think of tales and myths. And they also have different functions. And I also say that Aham and Puram was not to be taken rigidly, and there may be intermediate categories. If you take a Vratakatha, for instance, a Vratakatha is, I would consider, participates, it may begin as a folk tale, but it may function as a myth. Right? And the other interesting thing I found was, I was also interested in a contextual analysis, in contextualizing folklore genres. And you find that myths are by and large not told by grandmothers to children. Though they may be, but by and large not. Whereas folk tales are told by grandmothers to children, or by aunts to children, or people to each other. Right?
So where do the legends stand?
I will come to that in a minute. Legends also I would consider is by and large Puram. Puram. Because they have to do with public matters by and large. And the way, for instance, a town is named, or how a mountain came into being, right? Or why, or about a culture hero, These are not usually domestic matters. Or if you take the subjects, for instance, folk tales deal a great deal about, say, mothers-in-law, daughters-in-law, fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, right? Sisters, brothers. So they are psychologically much more inward. In fact, I would go on to say that more than myth, it's in folk tales you find a native psychoanalysis. Conceptions of what the real problems are in relationships, but not to be found in mythology, but in the folk tales. And this also fits the Ahampuram opposition. So like this, I was interested in seeing how far I can go with it.
It's a new idea.
And this is not what originally the classical Tamils wanted to do with it. And they were interested in classifying poetry like this. And I was interested in seeing whether I can extend it to other cultural expressions. And I found it very useful to do that. And I think this is probably true of not only South India. If you wanted how I can generalize it, this seems to be true of many parts of India. So if it is, even though I begin with Tamil, these categories seem to be capable of extension. Though I would not say it is universal, it seems to be capable of extension. Maybe, and I also read in Pierre Bourdieu, who has written about African communities, but there is a distinction between domestic and public. And once you've got that, you will see that games, rituals, not merely tales.
Even games may be
Ahampuram.
Yeah. For example,
and songs. Yeah. You'll find rituals, even rituals. The rituals which are done within the house.
It starts with because they have to sit as a purification. Then it starts from the home.
Yeah. Also, there may be many which are not done in the public.
Yes.
Like even in Sanskrit, you speak of Grihya rituals.
Grihya
Sutras. Or Grihya rituals also. You see? And that which is done outside and that which is done, for instance, a Vedic sacrifice is not done within the house. You have a public space for it. So like that, I thought that this may have various extensions. But I don't know if it's universal or not, and it seems to me widely applicable to all sorts of, and it was a way of talking about things. It was also a way of extending my studies of classical Tamil poetry into folk materials. Because one of my interests is also not to make clean divisions between classical and folk, because I think they're all related in various ways. They're always in dialogue with each other. See, that is another position I take regarding cultural materials, that cultural materials should not be separated out as this is folklore and this is not. I am not keen on that. And though there are special properties to each one of these, and we should also be looking at how they relate to other materials in the culture.
So how do you differentiate between myth and legend? The relation may change from culture to culture.
I think it will. That is what I would say. I do not know enough about legend because I have not worked very much on it. But legend may have something to do with locality. It may have something to do with local history. It may also have something to do with a division of time. You see, myth may be timeless or a distant past, and legend may be more recent past. And legend may be what you call closer to what one calls historical figures, historical places, whereas myth may not be like that. But I'm not sure of this distinction. I have still to think more about it.
So in the context of folktale narrative, which is not the participation of the children.
You may not hear it. Yeah.
The participation of children more
Right.
Kids are blood relations. And the Puram, usually the adult are the cosmopolitan or mixed race.
Right. Other families.
Other families.
Right.
But here I have made, I thought about this very long back. Inside the home, when the performer, grandma, suppose she was while narrating, she demands that somebody should give response.
Of course. Right. Of course. You must do that, yeah.
Otherwise she don't.
Absolutely. Quite right.
This is one
Quite right.
compartment. And outside the same.
Yeah. You're actually a man, an assistant who will say, yes, that is true. Yeah.
Nobody will give response, but it will continue.
But still, there will be response. People will shake their heads. All kinds of responses are being made at the same time. Clapping, applause. But not merely that. You also, one of the things that happens in public, like the bards performances, like Gondaligas and so on, there's usually an assistant who plays the part of an audience. Also, he plays the part of the audience. He will do what the audience should do. He will say, how the Guruve? He will say.
Yeah, he will say. But
or he will say, Inna Cheli, Kata ilig nintoitala. He will say all of those things.
He will stand as a substitute.
Substitute for. So what he does is he internalizes the audience into the performance.
But in electronic media, like when you produce the same tale through television, or
even in television, I don't know if Indian television does it. If you take an American television, if there is a comedy, they will also have canned laughter. They will have some kind of audience response included there, so that whenever a joke is uttered in the comedy, there will be laughter, and they have usually recorded laughter which they will put into it.
There is a series, Yes Prime Minister.
Did they have it?
Yes.
Yeah, this is fairly common.
Yes.
But I made an experiment with one informant. She said, somebody need I to say responding.
Right.
I said, without that, what happens to you? I induced.
Right.
Then she said, it won't look nice. She can't express her psychic.
That is not true. For instance, when you're reading a book, who is responding? See, there are different media, and one of the things that has happened in civilization is you have moved from a face-to-face society to a society where the performer and the audience have become distant. For instance, you speak to somebody on the telephone, so you don't see them. You watch a television performance. He cannot see you, but you can see them. Or you're reading a book, In fact, when you're reading a book, the author may be 10,000 miles away, and he may have written the book 1,000 years ago, right? But you still respond to it. Therefore, you internalize an audience in all those matters. So you can get different kinds of responses for this.
Yeah, this
because this face-to-face is not the only way. Is not the only way of making a performance.
Yeah, this response notes, that is these are notes. The time measuring notes.
Right.
These notes, where it will stand in formulae. You can add this into a formula because American, suppose tale-teller or corresponding, suppose they give response in different tone. But in Indian accent will be different. So this is also comes in the formulae.
I don't know if you would call it formulae.
No, they may stand because we are thinking of the first line and the last line and the style.
There may be what there is
Where you keep
this is a form of punctuation.
Yeah, punctuation.
It's a form of punctuation. That's what it is. It's like gestures.
Yeah.
You see, when I make this gesture, I'm punctuating my sentence. See, there is a relationship between my gesture and the structure of my sentences. If you watch people making movements, they are punctuating in two ways. One, they are punctuating by pauses. The other way, they are punctuating by gestures. And then this audience response becomes one more way of punctuating. Of course, it's also a way of feedback, so that the cycle is completed in a face-to-face communication.
So what's the impact of folkloristics on other disciplines, for example, linguistics or aesthetics? Folklore is very young when compared to other social
It is
sciences.
still very young. It's still very young. In fact, one of the things we still need to do, one of the things that linguists have done earlier, whenever they went to collect, for instance in India, Grierson's Linguistic Survey of India, you'll find that many of the texts are folk texts. In fact, it's the other way that it has worked. It is linguists who have extended folklorists.
Yes.
If you take Grimm, it was like that. Max Muller, though Max Muller was not exactly a folklorist, if you take Grimm brothers, you will find this. It is also true of Emino. If you take modern examples, some like M.B. Emino, the great Dravidian linguist, also worked on Toda, and he has written a whole book of papers on various folklore motifs. The Kota tales and Toda songs are some of the best collected folk materials in the country. So, it is not that folklore has, I'm sure in studying all these folk texts, he learnt a great deal about the language, because it's one of the best ways of collecting materials. Secondly, one of the things that folk materials have done to anthropology, it seems to me, is, of course, not enough anthropologists have worked on folklore. In fact, when they do, I think it will change anthropology. In fact, it is yet to come, in my opinion. For instance, Indian anthropology, I think will benefit a great deal if, for instance, if the anthropologists regularly, along with everything else they do, collected also folk expressions, folk tales, folk. In fact, M.N. Srinivas is one of the few people who has done that. And I think anthropologists, with their knowledge of their discipline, if they would take interest in folk materials, the Peters become almost a completely folklorist. Yeah. But it is just beginning to happen, I think, in this. Also, it is they're beginning to see that one of the things that has happened in folklore is that they have not paid enough attention to native aesthetic expression. There's very little work on that. They have become specialized, like ethnomusicology or folklore has become specialized within anthropology. But there will come a time when these specializations will have to break down, and it has to be integrated much more.
And what about the effect on the aesthetics, classical aesthetics?
Yes, for instance, in a country like India, I would say that the folk songs or folk tales or folk epics have to be taken into account when you're talking of poetics. For instance, if you take simply rasa theory, the theory of rasa, I don't think it would explain a great deal, or it would even fit a great deal of Indian literature. I mean, let alone all of Sanskrit literature. It is very hard, for instance, to apply rasa theory. People have done that even to the Mahabharata. They end up saying that Mahabharata produces Shantarasa. It seems to me ironic. This tale of terrible violence, this tale of fratricide, this tale where everything is ambiguous, this tale which disturbs you to your very core, they say ultimately it leads, they take you through all this so that you can have Shantarasa. It seems to me extremely artificial. Because it does not deal simply with Veera and Shringara, which are the two things which much of rasa theory has concerned itself with. Because if you look at Bhima's killing of Dushasana, it is truly bhibhatsa, and bhayanaka rather than anything else, right? And so notions like terror, notions like disgust, it's not just utsaha in the bhava sense. So all these will change if you take folk materials like folk epics. If you take, for instance, Pardhanas, if you take the Tamil Kolaichindus, which are all stories about murder, or if you take goddess myths, which we were talking about, which are stories of violence and desecration and deception, suicide, rape, all of that, and bloodshed, it will change our view of Indian literature. Because in the past they used to say Indian literature is all Mangala, everything ends in Mangala, or there is no tragedy in Indian literature. Keith and other people have said. We may have to redefine both Indian literature and our conception of tragedy, because our sense of tragedy may not be the same as Aristotle's sense of tragedy. So what will happen ultimately is that it will enlarge our sense of aesthetic categories.
But we have to think beyond the level, beyond genres.
Right. What we have to do is we have to think beyond both Sanskrit and Western categories, if we really take into account folk materials. In fact, that's one of the things we have yet to do. We'll have to devise a kind of poetics and an aesthetics which is not simply rasa theory, which is not simply Aristotle, but which may be something very different.
In Sanskrit poetics, there is a distance between the performer and the audience.
Right. Actually, there are many disjunctions.
Yeah.
Actually, to have, in order to produce rasa, there have to be 3 or 4 disjunctions. The audience, as you know, it says that the man who plays Rama is not Rama.
Yeah.
And the poet who writes about Rama is not Rama. And it is not his feelings, his bhavas which are getting expressed. And then the audience which watches Rama cannot identify with it. And if you do not have these, if any one of these is broken, rasa will be broken.
Yes.
Rasa will be interrupted according to rasa theory, which is quite right if you take rasa seriously. Whereas that is not true of many of our genres. It's not true for bhakti, for instance. When a poet sings about Krishna, he will cry, he will identify with Krishna, and when an actor acts Narasimha, he may actually be possessed by Narasimha. Actually, very often, you do Shanti. You do Shanti to a Narasimha. It has been banned. Yeah, it has been banned in some cases. So, for instance, all our possession rituals are pretty close to our some of our literary genres. Or, for instance, in when an audience looks at Krishna, he may identify with Krishna, he may identify with Gopi. For instance, if you take the Chaitanya school of Bhakti, actually people identify with different characters in the Krishna story, which you are not supposed to do as an audience. Therefore, they're both audience and actors and subjects at the same time. Right?
In Sanskrit aesthetics, bhava vinaya and bhavanubhava and rasanubhava
are utterly different things. Whereas that will not be true. And both in folk aesthetics and probably in bhakti, you will have to have some other way of talking about this, where the line between bhava and rasa cannot be that clearly drawn.
No, that gives a new dimension.
Yes. So I am now talking about maybe there is a bhava poetics, not only a rasa poetics. Maybe there is a bhava poetics which must be taken into account. So you see how by looking at folk materials as well as bhakti, because as you know, I work with classical materials, Tamil materials, as well as bhakti, as well as folk materials. I'm beginning to see all kinds of connections between them, because this is one of my
very important point.
this is one of the things I'm very interested in. Not to draw lines, but to see how one can illuminate other parts of the same culture, it seems to me. Because within a culture, these are not watertight compartments. They're all in dialogue with each other. Because there is a series and a multiplicity of dialogues which are going on within a culture. And that is the dynamism of culture. Otherwise we think of Indian culture as something completely static. Just as we think of folklore as static. Folklore is not static. It's every time a grandmother tells a story, she tells it anew. She is not simply reproducing it, she is also producing it.